So, welcome to our special meeting for the Central Florida Astronomical Society. Thank you for joining us here tonight. Welcome. My name is Frank Kane. I am your president. And if you're watching this and you're not yet a member of the Central Florida Astronomical Society, well, what are you waiting for? There are several reasons why you might want to join. For one, you get access to our private events such as this and our dark sky viewing locations. Also, you have access to our Lunar Telescope program so you can explore the cosmos on your own for free. Also, we have our online community through Groups.io with a good community of astronomical discussion. And perhaps the best benefit, quarterly meetings at the Seminole State Planetarium, which is by far the coolest venue for an astronomy club you can imagine. Also, your membership includes Astronomical League membership, including Reflector Magazine. And remember, we are a nonprofit 501c3 organization completely powered by volunteers, so every penny of your dues goes toward club operations and our mission. If you want to check out more and learn about our membership plans, head on over to cfas.org, that's cfas.org, for more information. Today, our guest is Dr. Seth Shostak from the SETI Institute. Yes, that is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. We should have a fun night here with some Q&A. And before we dive into it, just some quick housekeeping. If you do have questions for Dr. Shostak, use the Q&A button down there at the bottom in Zoom, and you can get your question in the list there. We already have a few coming in, so yeah, get them in while you can. And before I forget, a special thank you to Jason Higley. He worked with me on coming up with my questions for Dr. Shostak that we're going to start off with. And so with that, let's do a quick introduction for our main speaker here. Let me turn off the screen share here before I forget. So Seth Shostak is the senior astronomer at the SETI Institute in Mountain View, California, and the director of the Institute's Center for SETI Research. He has an undergraduate degree in physics from Princeton University and a doctorate in astronomy from the California Institute of Technology. For much of his career, Seth conducted radio astronomy research on galaxies and has published approximately 60 papers in professional journals. Seth has written nearly 500 popular magazine and web articles on various topics in astronomy, technology, film, and television. Seth has been a distinguished speaker for the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, and he was the chair of the International Academy of Astronautics SETI Permanent Committee for a decade. And you've seen him on radio and TV, on the Discovery Channel, Learning Channel, History Channel, BBC, Nightline, O'Reilly Factor, Good Morning America, Larry Keaton Live, Coast to Coast AM, NPR, CNN News, National Geographic Television, and more. And he's also the host of a 1-hour weekly radio program on astrobiology entitled The Big Picture Science Show. And last but not least, Seth has edited and contributed to nearly a dozen books, including his latest book, Confessions of an Alien Hunter, published by National Geographic. So check that out. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Dr. Shostak. Really appreciate you taking the time tonight.
Well, thank you, Frank. And I only wish that I could even partially live up to that florid introduction, some of which is true, by the way.
That's the edited version. I mean, I got that off your website. It goes, there's more. You've had quite the career, sir. Yeah, let's just dive right in. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got involved in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence? How did you land on this road?
Yeah, well, it wasn't very deliberate, to be honest. I had studied radio astronomy as a grad student, and I had worked at some various radio observatories. And I moved back to the East Coast. I was a grad student on the West Coast, but I moved back to the East Coast to take a postdoc position in Charlottesville, Virginia. And after that, I got a job here at the SETI Institute, which happens to be in Mountain View, California. I think you may have said that, but Mountain View is here in the center of the Silicon Valley. So as I look out the window here, I don't see much because there's a giant tree that blocks the view of everything except the parking lot. The parking lot is not very interesting, but it changes every 10 minutes. A car will go in and out. So there is that dynamic. But, when the SETI Institute people heard that I was in the area, they knew of me because of my previous work in radio astronomy. And they just called me up one day and said, "You want a job here?" And as it turned out, I did.
Well, it worked out well. That's amazing. So tell me about some of the tools that SETI has used for its search so far. So we have the Allen Telescope Array, right? That's
Yes.
one. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, SETI, the whole idea that you might find aliens by, tuning in their radio transmissions, that's an old idea now. That goes back more than 60 years. And the first one to try it was indeed Frank Drake, who, he was at Harvard when he got the idea, but eventually he, together with some guys at Cornell University, thought that maybe you could prove that we have some company out there by simply scanning the sky with a big antenna and looking for what are called narrow band radio signals. That was the trick, because if they're narrow band, they're made by a transmitter. I mean, there are some exceptions. Nature can occasionally make a narrow band signal, but that's quite hard. So they figured if you found a narrow band signal, you would pay a lot of attention to that, get other telescopes to look, and maybe you would have discovered our, cosmic confreres.
Right. So what has the Allen telescope array found or not found so far? Kind of brief us on where we're at.
Yeah, well, in fact, the first SETI experiments were done using existing radio telescopes, mostly at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, which is in West Virginia, but the headquarters are in Charlottesville, Virginia. And as I said, I'd had a job there, so I knew about this. And, it's still being done using radio telescopes, still being done using radio telescopes from the National Radio Astronomy Observatory, in particular, the Very Large Array. Some people may even have, some viewers here may even have visited the NRAO's array it's near Socorro, New Mexico. But in any case, if you're in New Mexico, it's worth the drive out to the telescopes just to take a look at these 27 antennas, some of which will be so far away you won't be able to see them. The 27 antennas spread across the New Mexico desert. And look, the Allen Telescope Array, which, by the way, is named not for Woody Allen, but for Paul Allen, the co-founder of the, co-founder of Intel? I don't know.
Microsoft, yeah.
Mike, I don't think he worked for
Something
Microsoft.
in Seattle.
Yeah. Whatever, yes. Somewhere up there in the Pacific Northwest. It's hard to tell what's up there because, there's so much moss on the trees, kind of blocks your view of anything. But, he gave the money to build this Allen Telescope Array, which, as I mentioned, is in New Mexico. And it's used all the time, but not for SETI. Well, that's not quite true either. Let me start again. It's used all the time for astronomy, for radio astronomy, for studying well-known astronomical objects that produce radio waves, things like quasars and, pulsars and things like that. But of course, the most interesting observations you can make are of something that's new or something that's unique. And picking up ET's broadcast would certainly fall into that category.
Yeah. I've been to the VLA myself, and yes, it's an amazing place. They were all in bird bath mode when I went, but it was still pretty cool. Yeah, so I mean, so far we haven't really found anything, right? I mean, what would you say about how hard we've looked to date and what that result means?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure it means anything yet.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some people say, well, haven't you proven that there are no aliens out there? And of course, that's not true. We've looked in some specific places, a few thousand places on the sky, but maybe our equipment didn't have enough sensitivity, or maybe we were just looking at the wrong frequency, or maybe there are just all sorts of ways, the sky could be filled with signals that the aliens are producing and we might not have tripped across them. So I would say it's early days to conclude that, we haven't found ET.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, with the distances involved, it's important to remember, like, the power of a signal falls off exponentially with distance, right? So how far out do you think we could realistically detect an alien civilization?
Well, there's no real limit depending on a couple of factors that we have no control over. To begin with, how strong is the signal? And the aliens could be making a strong signal either by, building a more powerful transmitter, or by using giant antennas or arrays of antennas to sort of focus the signal at one spot on their sky. And that would make it strong enough for us to pick up, perhaps, without costing them a whole lot of alien smackaroos. So, but the trouble is, you don't know whether the aliens are doing any of that. I mean, some people suggest to me, well, this is a hopeless task for you, Seth, because after all, the aliens don't want to broadcast their existence. They don't want other inhabitants of the galaxy to know they're there, because that might just, invite invasion, or maybe you would flood their planet with advertising telling them to subscribe to your magazine or something. So, we haven't found anything, but the amount of sky and frequency space and everything else has been fairly limited. And I don't think that you can conclude from that we're the smartest things in the universe. Although I have to say, some of my relatives have concluded that.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, they would kind of have to know where to point their transmissions to use any reasonable amount of power, right? So there's only so far out you could go where they would even know that our civilization exists, I would think. Is that like
Well,
right?
it's true. It depends on their strategy. I mean,
Yeah.
either they could try broadcasting inquiries, "Hello, Earthlings, we're the Klingons. Please get in touch." Uh, I'm not sure they would do that, but then again, I don't know much about their behavior at all. So you can't be sure. Maybe they would find it interesting to buy our used cars or something like that. But then they would need to know about us. And to know about us, they can't be terribly far away, because if they're more than, say 100 light years away, then none of our radio transmissions, and of course that includes the strongest of those transmissions, which are radar and television, would have reached them yet. So, they would have no other way of knowing that Homo sapiens exists. It turns out that finding, cavemen is really hard if you're in another star system.
Right. All right. So we've been looking mostly for radio signals. Is that right? But, I've heard about looking for lasers and maybe even gravitational waves. Like, what's your opinion on these other channels?
Well, gravitational waves, there hasn't been too much done in that area when it comes to looking for aliens. Although, maybe it's not a bad idea. I don't really know. It's hard to think of how aliens would use gravitational waves. But then again, would have been hard for our ancestors to imagine using radio waves for anything very interesting. But so, I don't know. As I say, I don't think that there's much to be said about the fact that we haven't found anything, only that we're not looking in the right way, because the alternative is to say, well, there's just nobody out there. And that seems very self-centered to me.
Absolutely. And you can never prove a negative. That's another thing to remember too.
Well, that's true too.
Yeah. But yeah, for gravitational waves, it's hard to imagine people smashing black holes together. I think you said that once.
Yeah,
Might be
that's
worth it.
right. I mean, unless you can find a compelling reason to do so.
Right. Excellent. So, talk about the story of funding for SETI over the years. Has it become more or less challenging to get people to devote some time and money toward the search?
Well, it's really gone up and down, depending, and it depends very strongly on private donations. When I joined the SETI Institute, it was a NASA program. SETI was part of NASA. NASA had a SETI program office or whatever. They had somebody who sat in Washington, D.C., who was in charge of all the SETI efforts that were being funded by NASA, which was essentially all of them. But that ended I think it was 1993, anyhow, when the Congress killed, it wasn't NASA, of course, Congress killed NASA's SETI program. They said, there was a senator from Nevada, Richard Bryan, and Richard Bryan just got up on the floor of the Senate or one time and said, this is a waste of the taxpayers' dollar. They're spending money on this, and nobody has found a single little green man, which was true. We hadn't. On the other hand, that's, you could have made the same argument for almost any kind of research. Could have said, look, stop spending money on this Large Hadron Collider because we haven't found anything very interesting. Well, you might find something interesting tomorrow if you keep at it. The same is true with SETI. SETI is relatively inexpensive as experimental science goes. So, it has been kept alive, not really very much with government money, mostly with private money. Individuals, actually, not companies, but just people.
It's probably a good time to mention SETI.org. So if anyone watching wants to chip in, go and join. I'm a member.
Yes,
too.
please.
Yes. In fact, I'm wearing my SETI T-shirt with the Drake equation on it in honor of this evening. So
Well, that's good in case we forget what the Drake equation is.
I know we can
just
refer
read
to
your
it.
shirt. Yeah,
Yes, exactly.
nobody's
But
ever read any of my shirts.
oh dear. Oh, where was I? Oh yeah. So speaking of funding, so here's a thought experiment for you. If you had infinite money to spend on SETI, what would you build? How would you spend it?
Well, you could, in fact, build your own radio telescope, for example, or an optical telescope if you're interested in optical SETI, looking for, flashing lights, lasers, maybe stuff like that. You could do that. I think that probably, however, the most effective thing you could do is just fund the research effort, which means paying people, paying scientists to do it. It's pretty tough to do when if somebody, a graduate student here, Stanford isn't terribly far from where I'm sitting here. they could maybe do their thesis on SETI, or maybe they're interested in working in SETI, but the problem is there's no money for them. So they're not going to do that, or very few of them are going to do that. So probably the best use of the money would be to establish a sort of permanent group to actually do it. And as I say, it's not terribly expensive compared to a lot of other basic research. It's not like you need to build a large hadron collider or something like that in order to do this.
That's an insightful answer. So you wouldn't just build a giant gizmo, you would fund people, get more brains on the problem.
I would, yeah. I'm partial to people, although, a lot of my relatives are trying to convince me otherwise.
Oh my. So, you've been involved in SETI for several years. So how's your thinking changed over the years since you first got involved? Like, have your thoughts evolved about how to approach the problem? What's out there? What's changed?
Well, I think that the big changes, obviously there's been a big change in the technology you can devote to the task. And that's only encouraging. I mean, we have, receivers that can examine more of the radio dial at a given time. We have light detectors that could find flashing lasers that are much more sensitive than they used to be. That's one change. And the other change is that SETI has become sort of mainstream. In the early days of SETI, it was dismissed by a lot of people as simply a pipe dream or worse. And, that kept it from getting funding, I think. But today, most people assume, oh, yeah, it's a good idea. And not only that, they assume it's already being funded by the government. So I guess you would call that progress, even though I'm still waiting for that government check.
Indeed. But yeah, I mean, a lot has changed. Like, we know that there's tons of stars out there with planets. We know some of those planets are habitable. So the numbers are starting to look more and more in our favor, right?
Yeah, that's true. And it didn't have to work out that way. I mean, you can say, oh, yeah, well, we expected that. Not all of us expected that. Well, I did. But, there were a lot of scientists who thought they understood how to make a planetary system, but it was a sort of a long shot. It was the kind of thing that wouldn't happen very often. And as a result, it could be that, yeah, the sun has some planets, but most stars, even stars like the sun, don't have any planets. That could have been true, right? We didn't know. We didn't know until we found planets around other stars. And that's a fairly recent discovery. So that's maybe the biggest change, is the fact that the assumptions of SETI have, to some extent, been turned into, proven facts, if you will.
Yeah, and this is a good time to bring up the Drake equation. You mentioned Frank Drake before, and some of these numbers plop right into that equation, right? So, can you give us our listeners kind of a brief overview of the Drake equation and what it's for, how it works?
Yeah, the Drake equation goes back to, I guess, 1961. I think it was 61, either 1960 or 1961. In any case, Frank Drake, who was working at the National Radio Astronomy Observatory in Green Bank, West Virginia. That's where the telescopes are. And, he thought a little bit about SETI and had to write something about it or give a talk about it. And he was able to boil down the requirements for alien existence into a simple equation. Just a very strings of 7 parameters. How many stars out there are sort of like the sun? Multiply that by the fraction of those stars that have planets. Multiply that by the fraction of those planets that are habitable, they have oceans, whatever you need, that kind of thing. And, he called it, well, he didn't call this the Drake equation, but other people did. For a while, they were calling it the Drake-Sagan equation, or even worse, from Frank's point of view, I think, the Sagan-Drake equation. But Carl Sagan really wasn't involved with this. This was Frank Drake's idea. And you can find it now, and maybe in the last chapter of every astronomy textbook. The Drake equation is very well known. And it's still perfectly valid. The problem is it's designed to give you an estimate of how many societies are out there having a nice afternoon while you're, sitting at work kind of bored. It was designed for that, but it doesn't actually give you a real answer. It didn't then, and it doesn't now, because there are many terms in the Drake equation that we still don't know.
Right, and they might be unknowable, right? I mean, so the actual utility.
Unknowable is, I'm not sure I'd go that far, but we certainly don't know it now.
Right. But it is a point to, like, it's a good tool for sparking the imagination and making you think, wow, there's pretty good odds of someone being out there. But as far as an actual, practical tool, it has its limits today.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough.
Cool. So I'm going to put you on the spot. What's your current Drake number if you have one? What's
My current Drake number?
Yes.
You mean in line for his inheritance, that kind of thing?
Well, that'd be cool too. But what is
Yeah.
N in your view?
Well, I don't know, but Drake himself estimated that there were in our galaxy maybe 10,000 civilizations that were advanced enough to be producing radio signals that we could pick up. And I have to tell you that my personal experience with Frank was always that he was very soft-spoken and very well. He would never do any self-promotion, right? He would never use personal pronouns like I or me, or well, that's not a pronoun, but you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
So that made him extremely likable, of course. But beyond that, you realize that he was underselling himself in a way. And while I admire that, he didn't advocate that your estimate of the number of civilizations, the N in the Drake equation, you think it's this number of societies, and I think it's that number. I mean, he didn't get into that. But his personal number was always 10,000. And as I say, since Frank seemed to be so right on so many things, I tended to believe him. I mean, 10,000 sounds like a good number.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Yeah, I mean, I think a while ago, I'm jumping ahead here to a question from Jason Higley. You mentioned that you felt that if they were out there, we would detect them within 20 years. Do you still stand by that?
Yeah, I came to that. I made that statement when somebody asked me, how long is it going to take you guys to do this? Now, you could say, I don't know, maybe 1,000 years or something like that. But if you do that, they immediately lose interest, right? It's like, I don't know, telling the Romans, we're going to invent the steam engine, and that's going to save you guys a lot of work. Well, when are you going to do that? Well, it's another 800 years. I mean, they lose interest right away. So, but when somebody asks me, when are we going to finally prove the aliens are out there? When are we going to finally see evidence that they're out there? It seemed to me, on the basis of the speed with which technology is advancing, that, a couple of decades was the right number. And so I bet everybody a cup of coffee, we'd find ET by 2035 or something like that. I may be buying a lot of coffee in the next decade. I don't know.
Well, I mean, so what can you say about just how much of the galaxy we've searched? I mean, how much of the sky have we actually looked at and over what wavelengths? I mean, how much is not known still?
Well, essentially all of it is not known. But the amount that we've searched so far, the number of star systems that have been examined carefully, looking for artificially produced signals, in other words, doing what SETI tries to do, is still relatively small. Some stars all over the sky have been examined, but the total number is still maybe in the thousands or something like that. And anybody who's taken an astronomy course knows that several thousand is not a big number in astronomy. So we barely scratched the surface.
Wow, that's
something my
important.
mother wouldn't approve of.
Right. So people also talk about the possibility that ET is a machine. So with all the buzz about artificial intelligence lately, has that changed your thinking on whether we're looking for organic life or their mechanical descendants?
Yeah, this is another throwback to some question that I was once asked. How do you picture the aliens? And I think I was asked it in connection with doing some consulting for movies or television shows. I don't remember which. And I maybe wasn't even the first one to be asked, but the aliens that you think of when people are asked, what do you think the aliens look like? They'll give you an answer that comports with what they've seen in the movies or on television. But in fact, when when I thought about it a little bit, and again, I'm not sure this is at all an original idea, but it seemed to me that we're kind of inventing our own successors now, right? What are humans going to look like 10 generations from now? Well, they're probably not going to look like us anymore because we keep building machines that are closer and closer approximations to us in their ability to think, right? So you can say, oh, they don't think now. Well, they don't, but are you sure they won't be thinking in 100 years? And I'm not so sure they won't be. It may be that, it's easy to build a machine that fits in your den that has the capabilities of the human brain. Now, I'm sure there are going to be people who contest that, but look, you know, maybe they're right and maybe I'm wrong, but maybe it's the other way around. And once you have a thinking machine, I think you can forget about biological intelligence. It's sort of a curiosity, but it's no longer terribly relevant. So I don't know what happens to humans. We probably become the pets of the machines. But in any case, if I can foresee that happening to Homo sapiens, I assume that something similar has happened to alien intelligence, and that most of the thinking in the universe is being done by machines and not by soft, squishy organisms.
Some would say we're getting there quicker than we expected. So how would that affect the search for alien intelligence if it's a machine versus an organic being, or does it?
I'm not sure it does. I mean, there may be some good reason why it should, but I've never thought of one. What we're looking for is the kind of signal that transmitter is required to make, not a natural object, and that would be true for the machines too. I mean, maybe especially true for the machines because they would have no hesitancy in building another machine to send their nightly newscast to other machines and whatever they're going to use it for.
Right.
So the fact that I think the aliens probably are machines, or at least the more advanced ones, I don't know that changes the search at all.
Yep. Excellent. All right, I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. So I think all of our members who have been out doing outreach with the telescopes for the public always get the same question at some point. Someone comes up to us and says, "Hey, have you ever seen anything weird up there?" And they're talking about little green men and UFOs. So what advice do you have for us on how to answer that question?
Well, you might shorten the conversation by saying yes, is your answer. But no, I mean, this is something that interests the public, and that's actually a good thing for SETI. So, I don't discourage it. But, with your, 8-inch Dob or whatever it is you're using to look at the sky, it's fairly unlikely that you're going to discover the aliens, because if you could discover them that way, then it would have happened already, right? I'm sure at least tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of astronomy, amateur astronomers that have, some sort of optical equipment that they can turn to the skies. And if there was something really unusual about that, that they found, then, everybody would be looking in that direction. And, professional astronomers would turn their telescopes on that part of the sky too. So maybe that's the answer. The answer is, just say the aliens are too clever to allow us to find them so easily.
Mm. Yeah, we always try to take questions like that, people asking about astrology as well, and kind of pivot that to a broader, like more focused interest in astronomy and science in general. And I think you've done some of that too. I mean, you've spent a lot of time just in general scientific outreach with things like the Big Picture Science Show, right? So do you see SETI as sort of a gateway drug to science as a larger topic?
Yeah. Look, I mean, where I live, there are a lot of scientists around. And, they're working on solid state physics, or maybe they're working on organic chemistry problems, whatever. And those, for the public, it's hard for them to relate to a lot of that, because to understand what somebody is doing in one of those fields requires some basic knowledge that they might not have. But SETI is very simple, at least in principle. It's not so simple if you actually try and do it, but in principle, the idea is, trivial. We're just going to try and eavesdrop on their radio broadcasts, our television broadcasts, our radar signals, or whatever. We're just going to do that. And everybody can understand that. As a consequence, SETI is a good way to, open up a discussion for the general public. It's also something that interests them because, they're all interested in aliens. Everybody's interested in aliens. I'm interested in aliens. Maybe the aliens are even interested in other aliens.
Let's hope so. Yeah, we always say astronomy and dinosaurs are good hooks for getting people involved in science. So aliens is part of that.
And dinosaurs doing astronomy might be even better.
I think I just got an idea for a novel. All right, I want to make sure we have some time for member questions here, but I'm going to sneak in one more of my own here. So I want to talk a little bit about the role of time in the search. So, it's important to realize that we're not only searching in space, but also in time. We have to make sure that a civilization is not only where we're looking at, but also when we're looking at, right? Can you talk a little bit about how that sort of constrains the search for alien intelligence?
I don't think it constrains it very much, because what you're saying is, look, depending on when you ask, the aliens might be doing different things to produce signals, whether they're flashing lights or radio waves or whatever. And consequently, when you ask does affect things. But on the other hand, if you look in a lot of places, maybe that doesn't matter, because as long as the aliens don't develop radio technology and then nuke themselves into oblivion, a lot of people like that idea. I don't know why, but then okay, then it really doesn't matter when you ask, because there are going to be some aliens out there. Now, again, we don't know that, but what you do know is that within a couple of hundred light years of Earth, there are at least a million star systems, and most of those have planets, and some of those planets might not be too bad. So, saying, well, maybe we're too late. This is a when problem. All the aliens have self-destructed, or they've evolved into, plants, or who knows what. Something has happened to them, and you're not going to find them. Yeah, that could be, but there's no reason to believe that that's true yet, and or maybe ever. So, I'm not sure that when is such a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I was alluding to was kind of the term in the Drake equation about the lifetime of a civilization, and we just don't know, right? We have no data on that yet. So.
Well, we do have data, but it only applies to us.
Right.
And a technological civilization, I mean, when do you begin to start counting? Maybe with the invention of radio technology. So, we've been around for 100 years, but maybe there's societies out there that have been around for 100 million years. I mean, given that you don't know, any hypothesis is tenable, at least at first.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I assume you're familiar with the rare earth hypothesis. Can you talk a little bit about that and what your personal take is on it?
Yeah, Rare Earth was a book that came out, I think, in the year 2000. It was by Peter Ward and Don Brownlee up in the Pacific Northwest. And I know that appeals to you, Frank. They wrote a book in which they sort of laid out all the things that are special about Earth. And, there are things that are special about Earth. I mean, there are things that are special about my neighbor's cat, but it doesn't mean that that's the only cat around, right? It's just that every cat has a little bit different characteristics, and consequently. So the Earth is special, but maybe it's not all that special. And at least the history of science suggests that if you think you're special, like most kids assume, if you think you're special, you're probably wrong. So, that's that's a premise of SETI, that, yeah, humans are pretty nifty and all, but on the other hand, maybe we're not all that special.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, science has kind of proven that theory out, like it turns out that planets aren't that special, potentially habitable planets aren't even that special. So maybe we aren't either. It's a great analogy. All right, let's dive into some member questions here. And remember, if you have a question of your own, please hit that Q&A button on the bottom there and get them in the queue. So let's start with Brock Rosser. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. I know you've appeared on the History Channel before, right? I think on...
Well, you don't appear on the channel. You appear on one of their shows.
Yes.
So I may remember the shows. I don't remember where the shows have been broadcast.
Okay. Well, this question is specifically about a History Channel documentary called The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch. Have you heard about that one?
Yes, I've heard about it.
All right. What do you think about it? Is that good scientific evidence, or is it a hoax? And for those that aren't familiar with it, including myself, maybe a brief overview of what it's all about.
Well, I don't know what it's about. It's a ranch that I don't remember where the ranch is. It's somewhere in the American West, maybe Utah. I'm not sure. There actually is a Skinwalker Ranch, and strange things are reported to have happened at Skinwalker Ranch. Now, mind you, strange things have been reported to have happened in, San Jose, which is 10 miles from here. And it doesn't mean that there's anything extraterrestrial involved. Just because it's strange and unexplained doesn't mean it's extraterrestrial. But people tend to conflate the two. But all I can say is, having been on a lot of these shows, right? I've been on a lot of History Channel shows, I know that, but I'm not sure about any involving Skinwalker Ranch. But I would only advise anybody who's, listening or watching this to be skeptical. because the idea of television is not to educate you. I mean, you may think that's true, but it's decidedly not true, right? They're there to entertain you. If you find it entertaining, that's good enough, because that draws in advertisers. And so the idea that the aliens would have come who knows how many light years just to cause strange phenomena at a ranch somewhere in the American West seems a little unlikely to me.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Yeah, I mean, I was watching Expedition X, I think it is, as a show, and they had some like alien footage, right? It turned out that it was just reflections on the camera lens, which I think is a pretty common thing that you
Well,
see.
yeah, or else people will shoot video through, the windows of their house or their car or something like that, and then you're invariably going to get various reflections that look very strange until you realize that they're just reflections.
Right. But before you realize that, they can look pretty convincing. All right, moving on to Manuel Urbina. Manuel asks, concerns arise regarding the potential attraction of unknown extraterrestrial civilizations posing a threat to Earth. How do we balance this against the possibility of encountering advanced civilizations with intentions unknown to us? Considering humanity's
Well,
turbulent history, should we assume that basically they're as aggressive as we are?
yeah, I don't know. That's asking, what is the physiology, or maybe worse than that, the behavior of aliens. I mean, obviously, we have no idea of that. But to assume that they're going to be hostile or malevolent or something, I mean, there's no basis for that either, right? I mean, if we discovered an island where people, and we have discovered such islands, where people had been isolated from the rest of the world essentially for their entire existence, and you find societies there, the locals doing whatever they do, for them to assume that, well, if they were to be discovered by societies in Europe or the Americas, something like that, they would be wiped out, it's not terribly realistic either. You're not going to spend a lot of resources to go wipe out the inhabitants of a small island somewhere, in general, not anyhow. So the idea that they might be hostile, I think that simply derives from science fiction, because in science fiction, you do need some, if you will, enemies. And, somebody's trying to wipe you out. I guess you could consider that an enemy.
Indeed, yes, all good fiction needs a antagonist. But I mean, this has come up like in various serious settings. Like we've intentionally beamed signals through like Arecibo and stuff to various locations where we thought there might be aliens. And there's been some debate as to should we have really done that? What's your opinion on that?
Well, I don't worry about it too much. People say you're just telling them we're here and they're going to come down and wipe us out. I'm not sure. They probably couldn't get that through their own Congress. We're not going to spend the money to do that. We got much better things to do with the money. I don't know. We don't find lots of evidence that anybody has ever been wiped out elsewhere, right? We don't find totally destroyed planets or see planets explode or stuff like that. Now, mind you, that could be happening a lot and we still might not see it. But, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's not very, if you will, there aren't many cost benefits for doing that in my mind. What you'd want to do is, I mean, if you discovered a new mammalian species somewhere in Africa, you wouldn't send out a team of people to go wipe them out as your first thing to do. I mean, you just want to, get in touch with them either by at least crating them up and sending them back to museums.
That's a good point, though. The energy and time it would take to actually visit us from anywhere, from another star system is massive, right? And we shouldn't forget that. So it's got to be worth it for them.
And that's cheap compared to blowing up their world.
Indeed. All right, Brock has another question here, if I can paraphrase it. So I'm sure you're familiar with all the congressional studies about UAPs lately. What do you think about that? Like, we're spending tens of millions of dollars to study these things from the congressional budget. Why? Is that a good use of our money?
I think that I'm not sure it's tens of millions, but it's certainly millions. I think it really is a security issue from the government's point of view. It's important to know what's in your skies, right? If you're going to send up aircraft, not just, United Airlines next flight, but military aircraft, you want to know what's up there, right? And have some means of pinpointing where all the stuff is. And so I think that that's why the government is interested in UAPs. Not every government is interested in them for the same reasons, though. The Soviets, in particular, would actually foment stories about UAPs to divert attention from military flying things, whether they were rockets or aircraft or whatever, which bore on their national security. So, yeah, I think that that's the motivation for the governments of the world to be interested in these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, UAPs are real. There are, unidentified aerial phenomena out there. We don't know what it is, so therefore it's you. And yeah, I mean, if it's an adversary with some technology or, some super fast drone we don't know about, we definitely want to know about it. Question from John Pinto. What about using the James Webb Space Telescope to find biosignatures? And what would be considered a rock-solid biosignature?
Yeah, well, biosignatures are just some sort of clue that there's life on some world. If you found, for example, if you studied a planet like Earth, or if you studied the Earth for that matter, you would know just from telescopic observations that there was a lot of oxygen in our atmosphere, right? And, tens of percent of the atmosphere is oxygen. But you wouldn't expect that if you looked at the atmospheres of other planets, even in our own solar system, right? Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, they all have atmospheres, but there isn't very much oxygen there. And the reason that we have oxygen in our atmosphere is due to plants. So life. So, if you find oxygen in somebody's atmosphere, it's not a terrible assumption to say that, well, there must be plant life on that planet. So, that would be the consequence. That would be a big discovery.
Absolutely. Unless it's all machines living there, right? We wouldn't necessarily need oxygen for them.
No, the machines just need some places to get an oil change.
All right. David LeGros actually stole my question. I was going to ask you this one too. So you remember Oumuamua, I can never say it right, but that weird flat interstellar asteroid that swung by a few years ago. What are your thoughts on that one? Natural, weird? What do you think?
Well, a lot of people seized on Oumuamua's discovery because it's a rock, and it's a rock maybe the size of Manhattan or something like that. I mean, it isn't, it's not a planet, and it's not an asteroid. It's just a rock, and it's probably just, the leftover material from planet formation somewhere. That's most likely what it is. And until you find some clue that that's not the case, that's probably the hypothesis to go with. There's no reason to think that it's extraterrestrial. People say, oh, well, its motions were a little bit different than you'd expect and so forth. They weren't that different. So Oumuamua, unfortunately, now it's beyond the range of our telescope, so we don't know. But you would be safe in assuming that Oumuamua was a completely natural phenomenon if you were to find another Oumuamua, right? And if you find that there's a whole population of these things. So that's what I would look forward to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dr. Avi Loeb, I think it is, wrote a book about it. Have you read that one?
I'm sorry, what has Avi Loeb said about?
He wrote a book about Oumuamua, basically making the case that it was a alien probe sent to
Right. Well, Avi Loeb is a very daring cosmologist, I guess is maybe the one-word description. And he has tenure at Harvard, so he's got the freedom to speculate on such things. And I think that's a great thing. I'm very thankful that Avi Loeb can do that.
Yeah, well, he got people thinking for sure. Manuel asks, is AI part of the searching system yet? Good question.
It is. Yeah. The search systems that we use and that are used by the University of California, Berkeley, and so forth, do have components of AI as part of the data processing stream. So yeah, it is being used. I mean, it's not that we have alien machines doing the processing, but AI techniques are used.
Very cool. Edward Copes asks a good question. I'm sure you've gotten this one before. Let's assume that we find evidence of aliens. What happens then? What's the process?
Well, you can probably foresee what would be the lead story in tomorrow's newspapers. That's probably the safest thing to say. What happens next? I mean, there are only a couple of possibilities. One is, you just write it up and forget about it, but that isn't likely to what's going to happen. What's going to happen first is every telescope in the world of whatever type that can be turned in the direction from which the signal is coming will be. And maybe you'll learn more that way. It's, some people would say, well, the best thing to do is broadcast a signal, with a message back in their direction saying, hi, we're the Earthlings and we mean you no harm, or whatever. But I'm not sure that would happen, because, if they're far enough away, it doesn't matter what you broadcast now. You'll be able to send a much better signal 20 years from now, so maybe there's no harm in waiting. If they were hostile, they would have already had their chance to wipe us out. They haven't done that, so that seems like a silly thing to worry about. But it would be a big story. It would be in all the history books, certainly in all the science books, because it would have been the first discovery that sort of calibrates how Homo sapiens fits in to what's in the universe.
And what's your personal opinion of how the general public would react to that news? If it came out that we had rock solid evidence of alien civilization several thousand light years away.
Well, I think they would find it interesting. I don't think they would, say, well, that's it, Marge. I'm not going to work today. I'm going to riot in the streets. Mm-hmm. Some people say that anyhow, but, it isn't likely what would happen. There wouldn't be panic everywhere, right? The idea that SETI has found something and is covering it up because they're trying to forestall panic amongst the populace, that's kind of silly. So, 60, maybe even 80%, somewhere between those numbers, depending on which poll you want to believe, of the American public thinks that, we already have evidence for extraterrestrials, and they don't seem to be panicking about that. So they're still complaining about the coffee at work, and that's unlikely to change, in my opinion.
I want some coffee now. All right, Christian Nunez asks, how will astronomy change if we find other extraterrestrial life and they call planets, galaxies, and other celestial bodies different than how we identify them? Well, that's interesting. Like, how might aliens think of astronomy differently than us?
Well, they might know a lot more. I mean, it's like asking, members of the Enlightenment, how will astronomers' view of the universe be different in the year, 2024 versus what it is now? They would have no idea, and I don't think we have much idea. But if you could ever understand anything they said, and that's a big if, but if you could, maybe they have a lot of good information for you, right? Here's all of physics. I mean, that puts a lot of physicists out of work, but maybe they can, get jobs with Uber or something. I guess you should think of this in terms of, some sort of analogy. If you could go back to the 1500s, for example, when the Americas were being mapped out and stuff like that, and give them all of modern knowledge, right? Give them an encyclopedia or whatever, how would that change their lives? Well, it has the potential to change their lives a lot if they can somehow use that knowledge. But of course, they don't have the infrastructure to use it either. They can't build things like radios and so forth. So I don't know. I think it would be philosophically important, consequential, because we would know, that we're not the only kids on the block. But in terms of practical differences it would make in our lives, that's much harder to gauge.
Mm-hmm. All right, Wesley Clem asks, with SETI's current technology, what is the limit on how far we can see well enough to rule out a star? And how quickly has that advanced over the years?
Well, that's just a question of sensitivity, and you can't really put a number on that because it depends entirely on the kind of antenna the aliens would be using to broadcast that signal. If it's a big antenna or made of lots of small antennas, then the beam could be, very precisely, if you will, targeted to Earth. And then they wouldn't need a very powerful machine at all. Their transmitter could have the same power as the headlights on your car, and you could find it here if they, use a lot of antennas to beam it only in our direction. But we don't know that they're doing that.
Mm-hmm. And from Roy McCrucky, I hope I said that right. Is the wow signal still relevant? Maybe give us a little review of what the wow signal is first.
Yeah, the wow signal. I mean, the Ohio State University for many years had a kind of a SETI experiment using an antenna they called the Big Ear. It was there in Ohio, and it had been used. Well, it had been used for astronomy, but when it wasn't being used for astronomy anymore, when there were other radio telescopes that could do what it could do and better, so it became somewhat obsolete for that. They just used it to sort of, they kind of parked the telescope and let it sweep the sky as the Earth rotated, and they just looked for signals that were very narrow band that could be attributed to alien broadcasts. And there was a guy there by the name of Jerry Amon who would come in every couple of days and look at the computer printout, because in those days, whatever computers produced went to a line printer and got printed out. And he saw this big signal on one channel, and he wrote "wow" next to it, and that's how it became known as the wow signal. The wow signal. I mean, I've talked to people at Ohio State about the wow signal in the past, and I asked them what they think it was, and they say instrumental. So it was produced there in Ohio. And since then, I think that the antenna has been turned into a housing development or a tennis court or something fairly unconnected with extraterrestrials.
Interesting. Yeah, I remember a more recent story. I forget where it was, but some signal turned out to just be the microwave in the break room when they were closing it the wrong way.
Yeah, that's a story I wrote, actually.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the story there, if I remember right, if you opened the microwave before it was really done, it gave you a brief burst of microwave energy. And was that the VLA or was it a different one?
I don't recall that it was at the VLA. I think it was in Greenbank, West Virginia, but I'm not sure anymore. I don't recall.
Oh, you're probably right.
No. It may have been in Australia. Anyhow.
Okay, cool. But it's just another story of how, it's sometimes hard to filter out man-made interference, and
it's always hard to filter out man-made interference. That's one of the biggest problems that SETI has. The radio spectrum is not quiet. If you really want to do a sensitive SETI experiment, move the whole thing to the backside of the moon, because there it is quiet. The meals are not so good, but
well, that might be within reach pretty soon. Let's close up with a couple of questions from Jason Higley. So Jason asks, reflecting on your career in SETI and as a science advocate on your syndicated radio show, is there some advice you might give to the next generations of SETI scientists?
Well, all I can recall is that when I was a student, even a grad student, and people said, look, I want to tell you my personal experience in order to benefit you, I immediately stopped listening to them and, began imagining what I was going to do with my stamp collection on the weekend or whatever. So I can give advice, but I don't think anybody will listen to it. And frankly, I'm not sure they should listen to it. But the only thing that seems to be certainly useful is to, stay in school, get as much education as you can, and then try and get a job where you can be creative in the kinds of experiments you're working on.
Great. Couple more. Do you have time?
Yep.
Great. Manuel has one more. Let's say that we do get an unequivocal signal from an intelligent civilization. What are the plans to communicate that or not? Is there a plan in place to kind of ease the public into the idea?
Well, who's going to make the plan after all? I mean, is it going to be the local Rotary Club? Is it going to be a national observatory? Who's going to do that? If you want to send a signal back in their direction that they might conceivably pick up, it better be a pretty strong signal. So you're going to need a fairly strong transmitter connected to a fairly large antenna. Now, such things exist, but you don't get to use them for free. You've got to pay for the expenses of the observatory, but also for the people. People are always the biggest expense in these kinds of endeavors. And, so you'd have to do that. Now, is there a plan in place to do any of that? Well, who's going to put that plan in place? Again, My brother might have a plan in place to do this, but so what? Nobody's going to do it because he thinks it's a good idea. And there's no national policy to do anything about that. There are protocols for what to do in case of the detection of extraterrestrial signals, but these protocols were written during the time that NASA was involved in SETI, and they were basically the idea of one guy who worked at NASA at that time. And they're not bad, but on the other hand, there's no way of assuring that they would be followed, and it's not clear that that would be the best thing to do anyhow. But I think that one thing you can be certain of, if we were to pick up a signal, it would not be kept secret. And a lot of people I talk to, among the public in any case, think that if we were to pick up a signal, or anybody else, it would be kept from the public. It would be kept secret. And I always respond to that answer by saying, well, why do you believe that? And they say, because the public couldn't handle the news. Well, I think the public could handle it. They already believe the aliens are out there. So, exactly what about this couldn't they handle? So, there's that. But if we were to pick up a signal, the one thing you could be sure of is that it would be all over tomorrow's papers.
Excellent. All right, I'm going to wrap up on a good one from Jason Higley. Kind of a bigger question here for you personally. So you've spent a lifetime, thinking about the big picture, right? So what is your personal view of the future, not only of SETI, but also the possibilities of human civilization relative to others that might be out there?
Well, as I may have hinted already in this interview, I think we're only here to get the machines going. I hope I'm wrong about that because, as I say, soft and squishy intelligence seems to me to be preferable, at least if you're, having a dinner on the weekend or something. But, I don't know what to say to that. I would only keep an open mind, because this is perhaps the most important thing that could happen in the 21st century, if that's what we're in, and I think it is to discover that there are other beings out there that are at least as clever as we are. And I think that would be philosophically important, obviously. You can say, well, everything the humans are doing is so trivial compared to what has been done by others that it sort of humbles us in a way that might not be good for us, right? That kind of thing. But I do believe that the long-term consequences are very much more difficult to foresee, but at least we would know that there are other beings out there, and we might try and establish communication with some of them, at least those that are near enough to do that. And, people have said this gains us entry into the galactic club of intelligent species, whether they're machines or biological. And that could be a real turning point in the history of Homo sapiens.
Wow, great answer. That's a good one to end on, I think. Let's do a quick plug here. So if people want to see more of Dr. Seth Shostak, Big Picture Science Show, right?
Yep, although they won't see much because it's radio.
It's audio, yes.
Podcasts, whatever, mm-hmm. Yeah.
And also go and check out SETI.org, SETI.org, if you want to join up there and pitch in like I have done myself. And also, you've got the Confessions of an Alien Hunter out there still available and a great read. So thank you so much. Anything else you want to plug or mention before we wrap up?
Well, I won't plug anything except, my desk lamp into the wall here. No, but I mean, every time I talk to, particularly young people, I'm always impressed by how imaginative the public is, whether they have training in science or not. And I think that's one of the strengths of humanity, or at least the humanity that I'm familiar with here. And I also lived in Europe for a while. And I remain upbeat on the possibility that that biological intelligence, as limited as it is, might be good enough to establish its importance in the cosmos, and that's a remarkable thing.
That's a great optimistic, positive note to end on. Thank you for that. Oh my gosh, thank you so much for your time tonight, Dr. Shostak. It's truly been an honor, and I can't thank you enough for your time this evening. Okay, Frank. Well, listen, it's been my pleasure. I really mean that. All right. Thank you so much, and keep searching. Thank you. Okay. All right. Bye-bye. All right, folks. And for the members that are still watching, remember our next meeting will be on May 8th, which is another virtual one on Zoom. We got a couple of cool guests lined up for you there. And hopefully we'll have some Geneva dark sky observing before then. So keep an eye on Groups.io. More news to come. Oh my gosh, people. We had Dr. Seth Shostak. That is so cool. That's I'm a little bit starstruck here, to be honest. Thanks everyone who watched. And if you're watching this on YouTube later on, I still love you for that too. So until then, yeah, we got some other big speakers coming up that I hope to get. You may have noticed that as we get more and more big name speakers, it becomes easier to get more big name speakers. So let's see where that leads. So I will close up by stealing Neil deGrasse Tyson's tagline, keep looking up. See you next time, folks.